Welcome to my Storytime by MyBookSummary.com. Get ready for quick wisdom of countless stories and explore. The War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. The war in Afghanistan, which spanned 2 decades from 2001 to 2021, stands as one of the longest and most contentious military engagements in modern history. Involving a multinational coalition led by the United States, the war had far-reaching consequences for the country of Afghanistan, its people, and the international community. It is a war that began as a response to the September 11th attacks, with the U.S. aiming to dismantle the Al-Qaeda network and remove the Taliban from power. However, as the years went on, the objectives shifted, the nature of the conflict evolved, and the war became a complicated and elusive struggle with no clear end in sight. This long journey from military intervention to the eventual withdrawal of U.S. and NATO forces in 2021 is filled with victories, setbacks, and controversies. The conflict changed the lives of millions of Afghans, altered the geopolitics of the region, and profoundly impacted the global war on terrorism. This narrative attempts to capture the history of the war, its key events, the decisions that shaped its course, and the human cost it inflicted upon all involved. Introduction: the catalyst for conflict. The war in Afghanistan had its roots in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. The attacks, carried out by the extremist group Al-Qaeda, marked a turning point in the global fight against terrorism. The U.S. government, led by President George W. Bush, declared a war on terror and launched an unprecedented military campaign to target those responsible for the attacks. Afghanistan, under the control of the Taliban regime, became a focal point of this global effort, as the Taliban had provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and his network. In response to the Taliban's refusal to hand over bin Laden, the U.S. initiated Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF, on October 7, 2001, with the goal of dismantling Al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power. What began as a quick military strike soon morphed into a far more complex and enduring conflict that would consume both Afghanistan and the U.S. military for the next 2 decades. The initial phase, the fall of the Taliban and the search for Al-Qaeda. 1. Early successes and the collapse of the Taliban. The initial phase of the war was marked by a swift and decisive military campaign. The U.S., supported by its NATO allies, launched airstrikes against Taliban positions and Al-Qaeda strongholds. The U.S. also relied heavily on the support of the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan warlords opposed to the Taliban, to fight on the ground. The Taliban regime, which had ruled Afghanistan since the mid-1990s, quickly crumbled under the pressure of the U.S. bombardment and the ground offensive by opposition forces. By December 2001, the Taliban had been ousted from Kabul, and most of Afghanistan fell under the control of the U.S.-backed Afghan government. In the chaos that followed the Taliban's collapse, the search for Osama bin Laden became one of the central objectives of the war. However, despite an extensive military manhunt, bin Laden eluded capture, famously hiding in the mountainous region along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The failure to capture or kill bin Laden early in the conflict would haunt U.S. forces for many years and fuel criticisms of the war's effectiveness. 2. The emergence of insurgency and the seeds of prolonged conflict. Although the Taliban had been removed from power, Afghanistan remained deeply unstable. The country's infrastructure had been destroyed during the years of civil war and the Taliban's rule. Additionally, the lack of a cohesive central government, coupled with corruption and infighting among various factions, created a power vacuum that insurgent groups could exploit. While the U.S. and NATO forces focused on rebuilding the country and training Afghan security forces, the Taliban, aided by local tribes and other insurgent groups, began regrouping. The Taliban's insurgency was initially small and disorganized, but it grew stronger as time went on, fueled by the dissatisfaction of many Afghans with the government, widespread poverty, and the presence of foreign troops. By 2006, the Taliban had re-emerged as a formidable force, particularly in the southern and eastern regions of Afghanistan. 2. The war expands, surge and stalemate. 1. The surge, a new strategy. In 2009, the war in Afghanistan reached a turning point. President Barack Obama, who had inherited the war from his predecessor George W. Bush, faced increasing pressure to find a way to stabilize the country and prevent it from falling into chaos. At the time, the U.S. was engaged in two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, and there was growing concern about the effectiveness of the strategy in Afghanistan. In response to the deteriorating situation, President Obama announced a surge of U.S. troops in 2009, adding over 30,000 soldiers to the American presence in Afghanistan. The goal of the surge was to provide security in key areas, particularly in the South, and to create the conditions for a political resolution to the conflict. The surge was accompanied by an increase in counterinsurgency operations, which focused on protecting Afghan civilians and winning hearts and minds. While the surge temporarily improved security in some regions, it was clear that the insurgency was far from defeated. The Taliban continued to operate in rural areas and launch attacks on major cities, including Kabul. Additionally, the challenge of building a stable Afghan government remained immense. The Afghan political system was deeply corrupt, and the U.S. and its allies struggled to foster good governance. 2. The return of the Taliban and the challenge of nation-building. By 2010 and 2011, the Taliban's insurgency was in full swing. Attacks on Afghan and NATO forces became more frequent, and civilian casualties reached record levels. The U.S. and its allies found themselves caught in a prolonged conflict with no clear end in sight. Attempts to build a stable Afghan government and economy faced repeated setbacks, and the country's security situation remained tenuous at best. At the same time, the U.S. and NATO forces began to draw down their presence in the country. In 2011, Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, was killed in a raid by U.S. Navy SEALs in Pakistan. Although his death was seen as a significant victory in the war on terrorism, it did little to resolve the broader issues facing Afghanistan. In the years that followed, the U.S. began to shift its focus to training and mentoring Afghan security forces, with the goal of eventually transferring responsibility for security to the Afghan government. However, the Afghan security forces were ill-prepared to handle the challenges posed by the Taliban and other insurgent groups, and the country remained unstable. 3. The withdrawal and the collapse of the Afghan government. 1. The drawdown of U.S. forces and the Doha Agreement. In 2014, the U.S. and NATO formally ended their combat mission in Afghanistan, transitioning to a supporting role in the form of training and counterterrorism operations. This marked the beginning of a gradual U.S. military withdrawal, which continued under both the Obama and Trump administrations. By 2020, the situation had shifted once again, as the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, paving the way for a full U.S. troop withdrawal. The Doha Agreement, signed in February 2020, called for the withdrawal of all U.S. and NATO forces by May 2021, in exchange for the Taliban's commitment to prevent terrorist groups from operating within Afghanistan and to engage in peace negotiations with the Afghan government. The agreement marked a dramatic shift in U.S. policy, with President Joe Biden inheriting the responsibility to implement the withdrawal. 2. The collapse of Kabul and the fall of the Afghan government. As U.S. and NATO forces began to withdraw in the summer of 2021, the Taliban rapidly advanced across the country. The Afghan government, weakened by years of corruption, political infighting, and a lack of popular support, struggled to maintain control. By August 2021, the Taliban had captured several key cities, including Kandahar, Herat, and ultimately Kabul, the capital. The speed of the Taliban's advance was shocking, and on August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul, effectively toppling the government and ending the two-decade-long conflict. The fall of Kabul was chaotic, with thousands of Afghans attempting to flee the country, leading to scenes of desperation at Kabul's airport as U.S. forces scrambled to evacuate American citizens and Afghan allies. In the end, the United States completed its withdrawal on August 31, 2021, marking the official end of the war in Afghanistan. 4. Final thoughts: the legacy of the war. The war in Afghanistan was a costly and controversial conflict that left a lasting legacy. While the initial goal of defeating Al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power was achieved, the subsequent years were marked by a never-ending cycle of violence, political instability, and social upheaval. The war resulted in the deaths of over 2,400 U.S. service members, tens of thousands of Afghan civilians, and countless others caught in the crossfire. The failure to build a stable Afghan government, the resurgence of the Taliban, and the eventual collapse of the Afghan state raised difficult questions about the effectiveness of the military intervention. The war in Afghanistan demonstrated the limitations of military power and the complexity of nation-building in a country with a history of tribalism, warlordism, and foreign interference. For the people of Afghanistan, the war was a long and painful struggle for survival. The conflict displaced millions, disrupted families, and left a generation scarred by violence and uncertainty. While the world may have moved on, the consequences of the war will be felt in Afghanistan for years to come. As the Taliban returned to power in 2021, many wondered what the future would hold for Afghanistan. The lessons learned from the war are complex and sobering, and the story of the war in Afghanistan remains one of the most significant chapters in the history of modern conflict. Stay tuned for more enlightening content. Head over to www.mybooksummary.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share the magic with friends, and let's grow together through the power of books and interesting stories.